Today we've got Paul Kearns from Anthesis. Super excited to have you. We're going to dig into EPR, what it means, and why it matters. So, Paul, how are you doing today?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm doing awesome. I'm super excited to get into this with you. We've heard a lot about EPR. We're seeing EPR laws happening in Europe and in the US, and there's questions abound. So let's jump right in.
Yeah, we get questions on this several times a week, if not every day, it seems. So it's definitely a hot topic.
Let's just start with the basics. I know nothing. What is EPR?
Well, if you just stop and think about it for a second, most of us are familiar with deposits on some items that we purchase. That's a basic form of EPR. Deposit return schemes have been around for a long time. They apply to things like tires and bottles and batteries, even motor oil. I can recall when I was a kid growing up in Florida, and we used to take the wagon around and pick up all those soda bottles. 10 cents a piece adds up back then, right?
Yeah.
So it was definitely a different time. But deposit return schemes are basically only focused on getting the item back for recycling. They don't really cover all of the expenses associated with recycling, but they've been very effective at doing their job. I mean, the states that have deposit return schemes, they have bottle return rates in the high 90s. So they work. But EPR is going to change that a little bit. Producers have largely been cut out of the deposit return schemes, and there's been very little incentive for them to actually make some changes. So, if you think back around 2020, there was only conversation about EPR from Europe, in the European Union. A few years before that, they had passed the Packaging and Packaging Waste Directive, which called for each member state in the European Union to collect and recover used packaging, and many of them adopted an EPR program to do that. Like Germany was one of the first to have producer responsibility, and now every country in the European Union has some sort of extended producer responsibility. We'll touch on that again in a few minutes, but the goal of extended producer responsibility is to shift the burden for packaging waste management from the taxpayer to the consumer via the producer. And I use the air quotes there because a lot of people think it shifts it to the producer, but it's essentially a shell game. The producer will pass on the cost to the consumer. But there is really an important distinction in that the producer is now involved, because by shifting that responsibility to the consumer via the producer will be paying higher fees for packaging that is not readily recyclable. And so this can create an economic incentive for them to change. And that is the whole idea behind extended producer responsibilities. Actually get the producer involved in the equation. I mean, you think about it today, Our waste management system is just responsible to try to handle whatever is put on the market. They have no say. The producer makes whatever they want to make, and politicians and other interested parties have just decided it's time that changed. So that's what EPR is trying to do.
Let's break that down even further and simpler. What defines a producer?
So that can vary a little bit, but in general, the producer is the one that puts the product for sale first in the market. It's not usually a retailer. It's usually a brand. But if the retailer has a private brand, it could be the retailer also. And there's little twists on that too, especially if you look at Oregon's laws a little bit, because Oregon would hold the private brand producer responsible where other states won't. Anyway, that's just a little nuance there that they're going through.
That's something we do in the U.S., which we let every city, municipality kind of make up their own laws. We don't have a standardized definition.
You're exactly right. They're close, but they're not exactly the same. I would say that when you look at California and Colorado, their programs are pretty much right in line with each other. Maine and Oregon are a little bit different. Now we got Minnesota coming along also, so there are 5 states. But in general, the producer is the one that brings the product to the market for sale, puts it on for sale in the market. It's usually a brand. If it's an imported product, then it's the importer. So if somebody's bringing something from overseas and they put it in the market, they're going to be responsible for the EPR fees in that market. And I would say there's also one other little thing. Companies like Amazon and other e-commerce companies are also partial producers. So they're selling a branded product and the brand is paying their fees. But if any of these e-commerce retailers are adding additional packaging, they're going to be responsible for that additional packaging that was added to get that sale to the consumer.
All right, let's take a quick second to talk about idpdirect.com. Go right to that website, download the design guides, the sustainability guides, the recyclable icon guide, which basically lists out all the different icons. It gives them to you in vectors. You can drop them right into your artwork right now, today, and go right into production. All right, back to the pod. Okay, so then the producer isn't necessarily the person that's producing the packaging. It's the brand that's creating the need to produce the packaging.
Yes, that's exactly right.
Okay. And that's, and the reason I asked that is manufacturers of packaging are like, oh my God, this is affecting us directly, which it is, but they're not necessarily the producer. It's the brand.
Right. And they look at it as the producer, the brand is the one that's specifying what the packaging is going to be. So again, they're the ones that have the control, and they should be the ones that are incentivized to make the changes. Okay.
And then how does this break down, right? As new states come online, you just mentioned Minnesota, as they become, one might be more stringent than the other. So should brands be designing towards the most stringent ones, or are brands going to just follow at the whim of the country where, I'm paying this much in this state and this much in this state. And, that just seems so confusing.
So there's going to be some economic analysis, I think, that goes into that. Your point about they're going to have to make judgments on where it makes sense for them to make changes and where it doesn't. There's a principle behind extended producer responsibility that tries to reward producers for doing the right thing. They call that eco-modulation. And that can lower your fees for things like recycled content or maybe the use of bio-based materials versus fossil-based materials. Again, these are going to be program specific, but they're trying to incentivize these brands to do the right thing. They will always look at the cost of making that change versus, let's say, the cost of paying the fees. So if it costs more to add recycled content than it does to pay the fees without recycled content, they may make a judgment call and say, I'm not going to do that right now. Or if they have goals that say they need to hit a certain level of recycled content for their own sustainability program, then they might. But they're going to be facing these decisions all the time. And I think that the general guidance that I would offer with respect to preparing your packaging portfolio for EPR is to try to design within the guardrails. And the guardrails are going to get clearer and clearer, but they're essentially going to be saying design for the current recycling system. Differentiation is going to be bad. So I think that you're going to be looking for things to be in cans, they're going to be in paper packaging, they're going to be in plastic bottles or plastic tubs. But, beyond that, they're going to be challenged to fit in this recycling system. So anything that doesn't fit is going to have a higher fee. And the other point of guidance would be to zero in on the materials that are valued in the recycling system. So this is aluminum, this is steel, this is growing value for the plastics and the papers. So these things that have an outlet are the ones that are going to have the lowest fees because the recycling system can monetize them. If they don't have an outlet for it, it's going to be more expensive.
Have we seen brands that put their product in materials that are outside of the valuable recycled materials, starting to lobby against this and say, well, our product is needed by X community and we can't service that community if we're having to pay more. I just see so much packaging out there that doesn't fall into this category, where I can't imagine these people are not going to start lobbying against EPR.
So you may be familiar with Ameripen. Ameripen is a lobbying group out of Washington, D.C. that advocates on the positions that the industry, really needs to feel like they're being heard. And with respect to EPR, they're proponents of EPR, but they're proponents of smart EPR. And so if I go back and we talk about really the origins of EPR, it really started as a way to sort of, again, shift that burden of recycling from the taxpayer to the consumer via the producer kind of thing, right? But it was really all aimed at reducing waste. And what we're getting into today is we're getting into more of a conversation about, well, what is packaging's role and how does packaging fit into the overall life cycle of a product? And this is an important distinction because you've got a lot of effort to make things recyclable, but to make things recyclable is not always the best option either for the product or for the overall life cycle emissions of a product. So you want to make sure that the packaging does its job. It has to protect, it has to preserve, it has to contain, it has to communicate. Got to do that, right? Some things do it better than others. And then you want to make sure that over the course of the life cycle, you have minimum life cycle emissions. So this is a climate change concern that is growing as companies start to look at Scope 3 as being an important part of their overall emissions. That's where packaging fits. That's stuff that they buy. And so they're trying to figure out what they can do to drive that emissions category down. So it becomes a trade-off. You've got the strong desire to keep things out of the landfill, to keep materials in circulation, and yet you got to look at the overall life cycle impact and really do what's right for the planet. So one of the packaging formats that's long been challenged for recyclability is flexible packaging. And yet, if you look at flexible packaging over the life cycle of a product, it will be head and shoulders below anything else in terms of life cycle greenhouse gas emissions. So from a climate change perspective, it's a great choice. From a recyclability perspective, it's challenged. And that's one of those paradoxes that we're trying to figure out what the right answer is. If you do things to make it more recyclable, you're probably going to be adding more materials and you're probably going to be maybe downgrading its capabilities. So there's definite trade-offs, and this is a question that is still trying to be answered.
And that's one that comes up. I think the immediate reaction, the gut reaction is we've got to go plastic free. Everybody's concerned about sustainability today. What if I told you you can take your pouches, labels, your single serve wrappers and make them completely dissolve, make them completely disappear in water? That's what the team at SmartSolve has done. They've got a paper that is certified flushable. You can actually take the packaging, put it in the sink, put it in the shower, put it in the toilet, flush it. It dissolves completely into fiber. Learn more about SmartSolve. Go to smartsolve.com and ask for samples. Now let's get back to the show. Right? Because we've been marketed to that plastic is bad. Not that plastic is great, but I mean, I've got plastic in my body that's kept me alive, from years ago. So plastic is good in some cases. But the idea that things have to be plastic free in order to be beneficial, I think that that's a narrative that's not necessarily helpful. And kind of hearing that in most cases, plastic stand-up pouches are going to be the better solution if this is what we're looking at. Now, if we're looking at these other things, then maybe not. But is this something that your team at Anthesis deals with, like working with brands, helping educate, and then kind of directing into what makes the most sense for them?
All the time. I think that when you look at a brand that is trying to figure out its sustainability path, and we call that a roadmap, one of the things that you want to do is you want to try to make sure that they're not really falling too far outside the norm, because again, the norm is where the action is and where the system will respond. So we do a lot of benchmarking work and make sure that they understand where they fit and where their goals align with their competition, and then maybe give them some spirit to look outside a little bit, saying, okay, this is what your competitor is doing, but look at what your retailer partner is doing over here, because that could be even more challenging, and maybe give them some more ideas. So we look in that direction, and then we will help them screen across the globe for those solutions that might inspire change. And, we have a way of doing things in this country and in North America that is different than they do it in Europe, that is different than they do it in South America, that is different than they do it in the Asia region. So the idea is to say, well, how do they do it there? And does that make more sense? And can we transition? Can we think about how we might transition to that? Not everything. I mean, we do some things well, we don't do some things well. No question about it. But we have our ways of doing things, and it takes time to make that change. I think, fortunately, that most brands seem to be committed to making the changes. Sometimes they go quickly, and sometimes they go a little bit slower. But they're all on the same path, that they recognize that their future really relies in protecting their ability to do their business, and that is essentially sustainability. They have to protect their future. One of the companies that I think is, it used to be anyway, maybe it still is, it's derided for so many reasons, not fair. But I hold Walmart up as being an example of a company that embraced sustainability back before sustainability was popular, and they're still on it. You can go to a Walmart store today, and you can see out in front of a Walmart store a collection trailer for all those hard to recyclable items. They'll take them. Your community won't take them, but they'll take them. So, they want to be part of the solution. And you got to give the retailers credit for that, too. They're trying. The brands are trying. And I think, for me, having been involved with this for quite some time, the reassuring part is noticing that there's progress.
Yeah. No, and talking about that progress, if we look at your map from 2000, where it just shows EPR was really just laser focused in Europe, to 4 years later, 2024. I mean, there's EPR across North America, South America, Asia, the Middle East. It's like it's spreading, even as far as New Zealand and, parts of Africa. Like, this is now a global concern. Part of it is probably the amount of plastic we're seeing in the oceans, sure. But that kind of then leads to that plastic-free mentality. It's like, oh my, we have plastic in the ocean. We've got to stop using plastic. But EPR, it aims to drive the brands into smarter choices of materials.
Let's just say I think EPR aims to drive the brands to materials that fit in the recycling system. So whether or not they're smarter is up for debate. But I think that what they're really trying to do is make sure that material, that packaging material, can be collected, sorted, and recycled, which in many parts of the world today it cannot. So some of these countries that you look at on the map and you're wondering why they have EPR, well, it's just for that reason, because they had no waste management infrastructure. So the idea is, let's get those fees assigned to the packaging so that we can develop that infrastructure to be able to do that recycling and, recover those materials, keep them out of the landfill. Again, Europe is the one that's been held up for a long time, since 2000, as having EPR. They're going through a big change right now. I mentioned earlier the Packaging and Packaging Waste Directive, which is just that. It's a directive. It's a, hey, you'll do this, but you're free to figure out how to do it. Well, they're changing that. And they just passed the regulation, which says this is how you'll do it. And so what that means is now Europe is going to be more harmonized in their approach. You're not going to have 27 or 28 different EPR programs. You're going to have essentially one with the same type of structures. And that's a response to the brands that said, I can't live with all this diversity. I mean, I like diversity in my employees and my customers, but I don't like diversity in compliance. It makes it too complicated. That may happen here in a few more years. We get, let's say 15 or 20 states with EPR programs. Then I imagine that the same pressure will be on the federal government to do something to try to get a little bit more consistency so that we can have brands that can do the right thing. And they don't have to do 15 different things.
We talk about EPR. We talk about the producer having to pay more for products, for materials that are not necessarily the right ones that fit into the recycling system that exists today.
Right.
Who are they paying that money to? Like, how's that even being addressed? And who's measuring how much plastics and like, how's that part of it work?
So the mechanics behind an EPR system really involve this central organization that's called a Producer Responsibility Organization. And they get a charter from the state to hit certain recyclability targets for the materials that they've selected. So the state tells the PRO, this is what you're going to do, and you're going to report back to me on a periodic basis on how you're doing. And yet you're free to get your producers. The producers have to be part of it, but producers sign up to the PRO. The PRO goes and they figure out what the current state of the recycling system is and what the current recyclability levels are in the state. And that's how they figure out how they're going to get their fees assigned. So they look at the cost, they look at the value that can be derived, they look at what they're trying to achieve in terms of investments to improve the recyclability, and that's how they come up with their fee structure. And the fee structure is going to vary based upon material for sure. And in some cases, it varies based upon the material and the form. So that's an important thing to know. And right now, producers in the producer responsibility organizations in the states don't have their fee structures in place. You can take a look at some in Canada if you want some idea of what they look like. I don't know that the U.S. will be different, or probably will, but probably not that much different. But that PRO is a central organization. Producers sign up to the PRO to manage the recycling of their packaging. And then producer responsibility organizations pay fees to the waste management industry to handle the collection and the sorting. They get fees from the producers, but the consumers are paying to buy the product. So the consumers actually paying the producer and the producers paying the PRO, and then the fees go to the waste management industry. And that packaging, that basically comes from the producer to the consumer, and then you put it out the curb and the waste management people pick it up. So it's a tight little system. It works pretty well, and there's definitely a long track record of seeing how it works.
So if I'm a brand, okay. So then if I'm a brand and I'm selling in Oregon, and in order to have these fees assigned to me, I've got to sign up with a PRO and give them my packaging.
Yeah.
What if I just don't sign up because I don't want to pay the fees? Like how?
When they catch up with you, you'll get a penalty. That's for sure. Mm-hmm. And you could be banned from doing business in the state. So there are fines, there are penalties involved. It's I don't know how long it would take them to catch you, but certainly it's a risk. And I think that if you're a big brand, you don't want to have that publicity of not being in compliance in any of the states that have EPR. Smaller entities might be able to get away with it. I mean, I can tell you that some of the clients that we work with, they didn't realize, let's say, that they had to file in the UK, and they're doing business in the UK. Or we just got one client caught up in Japan, they've been doing business in Japan since 2013, and they had not been paying into the EPR program. So that happens because there's a lot. I mean, there's a lot of countries, there's a lot of rules, and so increasingly bigger brands are looking towards partners to try to help them keep track of that. I mean, we know where it is. They don't have to bother learning it all over again. Just get a partner that knows what you're doing. They can help you do a packaging baseline, which gets you to the point where you understand exactly what you're putting in the market by material, by mass, and again, maybe by form. And, you probably also going to want to know how much recycled content's there and where the material came from and those kind of things. So that baseline is that key element that you can then use your sales data to inform about, okay, this is what I put into Oregon. This is what I put into California. And that's how the EPR fees are derived. So once that is in place, then compliance becomes sort of routine. All you got to do is figure out how much of each item you sold, you apply it to your baseline, and you calculate your fees.
So then in order to calculate these fees, a big part of that's going to be your specifications, managing your specifications onto your packaging. Right. You can't leave it up to somebody else. Like there's no guessing, because guessing can cost you thousands of dollars. If finding your spec data is a wild goose chase around your office, you've got a data problem. SpecRite is the only cloud-based management specification solution that every brand needs. Because if you don't spec right, you'll spec wrong.
Yeah, I mean, and I think today that some brands are actually guessing. They probably try to guess on the high side so they're not underpaying. But they don't know until they actually go and they compile their specifications. In some cases, that's a real challenge. And so brands would hire a firm like Anthesis to do a supplier engagement, which means go out to the supplier that's sending you that product and figure out exactly how much packaging's in there. I mean, we did one of these for a big grocery chain that has all these private brands, and all these private brands come from all these private brand suppliers. So they had no clue as to how much steel was in that can or how much paper was in that label. So you just got to do it once and then keep it updated. But that first time is a heavy lift for most brands.
And you can't expect the brands to know, because they're worried about the product inside. They're making sure that it's safe. You've got a buyer that's just trying to get the cheapest cost for the best unless you're in the packaging industry, people don't really care about the packaging. They just want to make sure it gets on shelf and it's safe.
That's right. And that's the number one job. And in a lot of cases, my experience has been that, hey, if it works for one, then they just do the same thing and give it to another one.
Yeah, no, exactly. So, Paul, as we start wrapping up here, what should brands be doing today to prepare for EPR?
Well, I just want to mention that there's a lot of things going on between now and 2027. We're going to see a lot of EPR programs come on place. We're going to see a revamp of the EPR program in the UK, and we're going to see a revamp of the EPR program in Europe. So got to pay attention to that if you do business in those countries. There are plastic taxes that are coming in Germany and Italy, and there's a plastic tax in Spain. And then the one thing that could change a lot of the momentum also is if the United Nations Global Plastic Treaty is actually ratified. It's supposedly maybe in the middle of next year. If that happens, then there's going to be a global call for EPR and maybe a bigger push from the signatory countries to do it. That could potentially change things in this country. But I think that paying attention to that, understanding what's due when is important. And on that note, everybody that's listening to this podcast, if it's still in June, then you need to be concerned if you do business in Oregon, California, or Colorado, you need to register with Circular Action Alliance by July 1st. That's a statutory requirement in those states. So don't miss that. I mean, I don't know what they'll do to you if you don't, but it doesn't matter where your company is based. As long as your product is moving in California, you've got to do this. Exactly. If you sell into California, you sell in Colorado, you sell in Oregon, you have to be registered with Circular Action Alliance. And that's just a registration. No fees, no data. They just want your name right now because they want to keep you up to date.
Sure. Okay. That's great, right? Those are things that you don't know because you're busy doing business. One last question here. So if I register in California, then I'm all set, right? I don't have to register in Oregon, all these states, or do I have to go in every single state I've got to register?
Well, that's a good question. Circular Action Alliance is the PRO of choice for California and for Colorado, and so far the only PRO that is in the approval process for Oregon. So likely they will be the PRO for Oregon also. So the quick answer to your question is one registration with Circular Action Alliance will cover you in those 3 states. It doesn't cover you in Maine. Maine doesn't have a requirement yet to register. And we don't know who their PRO is going to be. And it's going to be a few years before Minnesota's there. But to your question, those 3 states, you're covered if you register with CAA.
Perfect. And then any other states that pop up, you've got to see who their PRO is, and then you've got to sign up for them. You've got to be aware. So then being part of the Anthesis group is helpful because then I'm not worried about it. You worry about it, and you just tell me what to do.
I would say that if you're so inclined, subscribe to my LinkedIn or follow me on LinkedIn because I keep you up to date on this stuff. I will make sure that when these announcements come out and things need to happen with respect to EPR, that I'll post it. So you'll see it.
Sounds good. I'll have a link to connect with Paul. Paul, thank you so much for being on here. I really appreciate your time and knowledge on this.
And I thank you for this opportunity. It's been great to talk with you. This is an important topic, and I'm glad that we had the opportunity to bring it to your podcast.
Perfect. Thank you so much.